Claudia watched lovingly as her 6-month-old baby Danny crawled down the hallway, scooting along with one leg tucked up under himself. But suddenly, this sweet, normal scene came to a violent end as Danny's father walked in, saw his son crawling in a way he did not like, and became enraged. He grabbed little Danny by his leg. He dragged the baby down the hallway, and then he threw his 6-month-old into the wall. This was just the beginning, a glimpse into the abuse that would follow. Welcome to this production of SKB Studios. This is Danny Rawling, the Gainesville Ripper. I'm your host, Caroline, a university biology professor and true crime junkie. Thanks for joining me on my quest to understand evil.
When the sun won't shine, the rain keeps pouring down. It over my old head, wear a thorny crown. Got the blues, don't know what to do.
Daniel Harold Rawling, the Gainesville Ripper, was born May 26, 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana, to parents Claudia and James Rawling. His father, James Rawling, was born on October 20th, 1931, and he was in the Navy. Apparently he was in some sort of special forces unit when he met Danny's mother, Claudia. Claudia Beatrice Rawling was born Claudia Wilkinson in 1935, and she also grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana. Claudia met James when she was a teenager, right before he went off to fight in the Korean War. While he was gone, the two wrote letters to one another, and when James got back, they decided to get married. James had wanted to make a career of the military, but Claudia did not want that. She said no, and so James listened. James did not want children. Claudia did. In a book co-written by Danny Rawling and Sandra London called The Making of a Serial Killer, the real story of the Gainesville murders in the killer's own words, Danny describes his father as a war hero and lists some medals and things that James had won. I tried to verify the following awards, but anything that was awarded before 1980 is hard to verify. So, according to Danny, his father had earned 4 Bronze Stars, and Bronze Stars are awarded for meritorious service in a combat zone. His father earned a Purple Heart, which is awarded to those who are wounded by an instrument of war in the hands of an enemy, and a Silver Star, which is the 3rd highest personal decoration for valor in combat. In one of the stories that Danny described in his book, James and his fellow soldiers were fighting the Chinese-Korean soldiers. In Rawling's book, Rawling refers to these as ROCK soldiers, rock soldiers, which is problematic because the actual ROK soldiers, which is Republic of Korea, capital ROK, they're now the South Koreans. So I think he had something mixed up there. A soldier right next to James Rawling was shot in the head, and when he was shot in the head, it sprayed blood and brains all over James Rawling, but Rawling kept firing his Browning automatic rifle until all the bullets were gone, and then he fought in hand-to-hand combat. It's terrifying. In another story, James and other Special Forces guys were out on the water at night marking mines when one of the guys set off a mine, and it blew the guy into 2 pieces. So James obviously saw some really horrid things in the Korean War. My father was in the Korean War, and he would never talk about it because I think it was a very horrible thing. In yet another story, a new lieutenant led the platoon into an ambush, and then he ordered his platoon to surrender. Well, James, apparently, punched the lieutenant and knocked him out, threw him over his shoulder, and then James went on to lead the platoon to fight because he did not want to be a prisoner of war. Only 13 of the 60 soldiers that were in that particular fight survived. I would imagine that any sort of combat situation, I can only imagine because I've never been in such a situation, but any combat situation is going to cause long-term mental consequences for the people who were involved. So, did James Rawling have post-traumatic stress disorder? Well, first off, let's talk about PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And in post-traumatic stress disorder, what happens is some sort of signal comes in, all right? So you have this trauma, and that trauma can be, there's all sorts of different kinds of trauma. But so in particular, say this, he's in the Korean War, and so the noise of anything that sounds like a gun could trigger PTSD, right? So you might be wondering exactly what PTSD is. We all know kind of anecdotally what PTSD, because everybody's got a friend or someone, a family member, somebody who's been through trauma who struggles with PTSD. Your body has a couple of divisions, right? So you've got a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is your brain, your spinal cord. Peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves and things that run to the different parts of your body. Okay. Now, if we break these things down just even a little bit more, in the peripheral nervous system, there are a couple other divisions. One is somatic, and that's the one that controls your skeletal muscles, like things that are under voluntary control. Like if you say, I'm going to stand up and go walk, that's the somatic nervous system that is functioning there. The other part is called the autonomic nervous system. And what's autonomic sound like? It sounds like automatic, right? So within the autonomic nervous system, there are 2 divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So you're probably more familiar with these in their street terms, which is fight or flight and rest and digest. Right? So think about the last time you were scared and what happened, or you were nervous, or you were angry. What happened to your body? What did you feel, right? Well, here's what causes the feelings that you feel to happen. So, say if you have trauma because of a combat situation, then you'll hear a noise or see something that triggers your brain to think that you're back in that traumatic situation. And so a signal is sent to a structure in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is, you can kind of think of it, and this is a very generalized description. The amygdala is your brain's fear center. So some kind of signal tells the amygdala, okay, we're back in this trauma situation, so now we've got to protect ourselves. So the amygdala interprets this danger or the perceived danger, and it will send a message to a structure in the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a really important structure in your brain. It oversees a lot of functions within your body. Okay, but we'll kind of narrow it down here to what we're talking about. So the hypothalamus then initiates a sympathetic nervous system response, and it does this by activating autonomic nerves, right? So automatic nerves. These autonomic nerves are going to do a few things. One is they're going to send a signal to your adrenal glands, right? And so your adrenal glands are the ones that sit right on top of your kidneys. And I'm sure you've heard of like adrenal fatigue and stuff, right? If somebody is in a constant state of fight or flight, they can make their adrenal glands kind of tired. But so it triggers the adrenal glands to dump copious amounts of something called epinephrine. And epinephrine is your body's adrenaline, right? So epinephrine is the physiological term for adrenaline, right? So it causes huge amounts of epinephrine to be dumped into the bloodstream. So epinephrine then is going to do a few things. One, it's going to cause an increase in your heart rate and an increase in the force of contraction of your heart. So again, think back to the last time you were scared or angry. It felt like your heart was going to beat out of your chest, right? Okay. At the same time, epinephrine is also going to cause the bronchioles in your lungs to dilate. So it's going to increase how much air you can bring into your lungs. It's also going to cause an increased amount of blood and oxygen to be shuttled to your skeletal muscles. And these are the ones that you would use like to run away or to stay and fight. It also increases blood and oxygen to your adrenal glands so that you can dump more and more epinephrine. Okay, so once this initial surge of epinephrine starts to decrease, and by the way, when a sympathetic nervous system response is happening, all of your blood is being shuttled to the places where it's needed most. So when you're in a fight or flight situation, you don't really need to be digesting your food, right? You don't need to be actively making urine, right? So the blood flow to those areas is going to decrease, and it's going to increase to the places where you need it. All right, so once that initial surge of epinephrine starts to decrease, the hypothalamus then activates the second part of things, which is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, right? That's a mouthful. So the hypothalamus then will secrete a hormone called corticotropin releasing hormone. And then corticotropin releasing hormone travels to the pituitary gland, and it triggers the release of another hormone called adrenocorticotropic hormone. And the adrenocorticotropin hormone then goes to the adrenal glands, and it triggers the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Well, cortisol is that pesky stress hormone. And anyway, so cortisol then keeps your body on high alert. Well, typically, if you're somebody who does not have PTSD, when you are scared, angry, whatever situation you're in, as soon as that threat is gone, your body goes right back down to its resting levels, right? But in somebody with PTSD, what happens is the amygdala starts to increase over time and increases in size. And so that's why, I have some PTSD from some childhood stuff that happened. So if somebody comes at me at a weird angle, I jump. Even though I see them coming and I know that person's not going to hurt me, I still jump, right? And that's because your amygdala has increased in size, so there's more stuff happening there. And at the same time, you get a decrease in volume in a couple other places in the brain. One of these is called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is connected to short-term memory and taking that short-term memory and putting it into long-term memory. So when the hippocampus decreases in size, what that means is that you have a more difficult time deciphering between what's an actual threat and what isn't a threat, right? So that's why, even though I know somebody coming at me from a weird angle, most likely is not going to hurt me, I still react by jumping, right? Because your brain becomes conditioned. And it's kind of like, if you think about how a river flows, right? The more a river flows in one direction, the more edged out or etched out in the ground the riverbed becomes, right? From the pathway going over and over and over again. Okay, so that's kind of a little mini lesson on what post-traumatic stress disorder is, or not what it is, but the physiological aspects of it. Okay, so back to James Rawling and the Korean War. So the Korean War happened from June 25th, 1950 to July 27th, 1953. According to a 2018 article titled Psychometric Properties of the Mississippi Scale for Combat-Related Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Based on Veterans' Period of Service, which is it's a 35-item assessment that's scored on a Likert scale. And a Likert scale is like that, 1 to 5, 1 being I don't agree, 5 being I agree a whole lot, right? So what they found, they assessed 202 Korean War veterans, and they found that 74% of those that were seeking treatment presented with PTSD. In another study, one that was published way back in 2007 in the British Journal of Psychiatry, the researchers found that 26 to 33% of Australian Korean War vets presented with PTSD even 50 years after the conflict. Similar to that 2007 article, an article way back from 1990 by Blake et al. It indicated that 30% of Korean War veterans presented with PTSD. So is there a correlation between combat-related PTSD and domestic violence? Well, there seems to be such a correlation. And again, I'm making broad, sweeping kind of generalizations, and there are always exceptions. But according to a 2014 article that was titled High Risk of Military Domestic Violence on the Home Front, 21% of domestic violence is attributed to combat veterans with PTSD, and that 80% of vets diagnosed with PTSD reportedly engaged in at least one act of violence in the year prior to the time of assessment. In a 2017 article published in the journal Aggression and Violent Behavior, the authors state that within the first year following a soldier's return, 48% of combat vets with PTSD reported engaging in physical aggression, with 20% having engaged in severe violence. So James may not have been a violent or aggressive person prior to his combat experiences, but he sure was violent and aggressive after. And I'm not excusing domestic violence in any way. I don't care what you've been through, what horrible things you have seen or done or had done to you. That does not make domestic violence okay in any way, shape, or form. All right, so James and Claudia got married. Well, James did not want children. After they got married, they moved to Columbus, Georgia, and Claudia got pregnant. Okay, and of course, James was not very happy with this. So why did Claudia end up pregnant? Well, during my lifetime, birth control pills have been available. And for a lot of years, or a number of years, birth control is even covered by health insurance. This was not the case for women in the 1950s. So in 1873, there was a federal law called the Comstock Act. And this law prohibited the mailing of any birth control through the mail. And so that would mean, mailing it from the place of creation to the pharmacies, that sort of thing. So many states actually took that Comstock law, and they included additional restrictions against birth control. So in fact, in 1965, 26 states outlawed the sale or use of birth control to unmarried women. That the world was an interesting place. Of course, abortion was also illegal. It was not until Roe v. Wade in 1973 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state restrictions on abortion were unconstitutional. So what does this mean? This means that Claudia had no real way of preventing a pregnancy from happening. So even though they were both involved in the activities that led to her pregnancy, James actually blamed Claudia for getting pregnant. So during her pregnancy, James abused Claudia. He choked her, he'd hold her down. One time he even threw her down a flight of stairs. Not super nice. James seemed embarrassed by her, and he blamed her for her pregnancy. He would not go anywhere with her when she was in maternity clothes. I just can't imagine a man feeling that way. So she left him during her pregnancy because he was demanding, and he had started to sleep with a knife under his pillow, which really scared her. So she left Columbus, Georgia, and she went back to Shreveport. But after a short period of time, James followed her. Now, stress during pregnancy can trigger fight or flight in mom, and chronic stress can then cause differences in brain development of that embryo fetus, right? So when I was talking about PTSD, we talked about fight or flight, right? Chronic stress is basically, there's a lot of different things, ways you can describe chronic stress, but chronic stress is basically you stay in this heightened sense of alert, this heightened state of alert. So you are on edge, waiting for the next thing to happen. So your body never has time to relax. And if you think about what happens during a fight or flight response, your heart rate is just really going fast and really strong. Well, over time, if you're in this elevated state of fight or flight, then that can cause long-term damage to your heart and blah, 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 right? Okay, so some of the differences that can occur in brain development in this unborn fetus can include things like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder later on in the child's life, and that's according to a 2012 study in the Journal of the Canadian Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. It can also lead to teen depression, which is according to a 2019 article published in Child Development. During pregnancy, it's important that the mother stays healthy and happy and that everything is okay mentally, and in order for her developing fetus to develop properly. So we know James was abusive all throughout Claudia's pregnancy. Well, on May 26, 1954, that was the day that Danny Rawling was born. James tried to send Danny after he was born to Claudia's mother, stating that Claudia was not grown up enough to take care of the baby. He said that the baby was Claudia's, not his, and that as far as he was concerned, he would never be proud of Danny. Okay, this is what he's saying about his newborn baby. Now, during childbirth, the doctors had to use forceps in order to get Danny out. And there's some possible risks that can happen. Most of them are pretty rare, but they include minor facial injuries due to the pressure of the forceps, temporary weakness in facial muscles, external eye trauma, skull fracture, bleeding within the skull, and seizures. Okay, so forceps aren't always a great thing. Once Claudia and James brought Danny home, it seemed that James was jealous of Danny. Even when Danny was a newborn, his mother wasn't allowed to pick him up when he cried, and she wasn't able to offer the baby any comfort unless James wasn't around. So was James really jealous of Danny? Why would a man be jealous of or not love his own child? For most of this seems inconceivable. How can a parent not love their child? Well, there are reasons that this might happen. One of these reasons is some kind of unresolved trauma in the parent's own life. The parents may not be emotionally or developmentally mature enough, and they may view the child as a threatening dependent for whom they are not prepared to care for. Men can be jealous of the bond that exists between mother and child. The jealousy can come from the fact that mom is now directing her energy and love elsewhere, and it can result in an inability in the father to build that same kind of bond. So from an early age, Danny tried to win his father's love and attention, following him around, making scenes, all in an effort to get his approval. But all this did was ensure James would fly into a rage and beat Danny more. So what happens when the mother-infant bond is not able to occur healthily? Every serial killer that I have studied or looked at, there is some sort of mother issue. Either mother is dominating, overly dominating, or mother is totally mentally absent. And in either case, especially in the absence, and in this case, that would have been what was going on with Danny, with Claudia and her ability to bond with Danny, because James would not let her show that baby the love that you need to show an infant when they're first, that you need to show your child. So there's a hormone called oxytocin And if you've listened to any of my other episodes on other serial killers like Ed Kemper or Jeffrey Dahmer, Anthony Sowell, see that this seems to be a reoccurring theme that's happening. There's some sort of barrier to the mother-infant bond. Okay, so there's a hormone called oxytocin, and oxytocin is responsible for uterine contractions during childbirth and for the milk letdown reflex during breastfeeding, but it's also referred to as the cuddle hormone. During breastfeeding, baby suckling stimulates mom's posterior pituitary gland to release oxytocin. And as this is happening, baby's posterior pituitary also releases oxytocin. So mom releases oxytocin, baby releases oxytocin. There's just all sorts of love happening between the two of them. So in addition to all of the healthy stuff that you pass on to your baby in breast milk, one of the other really super important parts of breastfeeding is the contact between baby and mom or caregiver, whoever it is. Because this persistent body contact and nurturing from mom or primary caregiver will elevate the baby's oxytocin. In the absence of baby's own oxytocin, cortisol levels will rise, which is part of the stress response. And remember, cortisol is that pesky stress hormone that is elevated in people who have issues with long-term stress. It's also oxytocin that's responsible for the attachment between parent and baby. Oxytocin pathways are negatively affected by prenatal stress, right, like getting abused by your husband, prenatal drug use, and exposure to adversity, right? So, all of the stuff that Claudia was dealing with from James would have caused prenatal stress. And further, if a baby is forcibly and abruptly weaned, it can feel like to the baby a rejection, and a baby can't critically think through what's really going on. It's this instinctual reaction that that mother doesn't want them, even though they can't really think in those terms. Oxytocin can also intensify memories of bonding gone bad, such as in cases where men have poor relationships with their mothers, according to a 2015 article in Live Science. There are 4 neurotransmitters, oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and endorphin, that are responsible for mood and mental health. Without this oxytocin-driven bonding early on, there is almost a guarantee of a plethora of problems throughout the child's life. Okay, and these can be anywhere from reactive attachment disorder to personality disorders that can present themselves much later in life. So during these early years, when Danny was a baby, Claudia would occasionally leave James, but he would always manage to get her to return. And I'm not excusing James's behavior, nor am I attempting to shame Claudia's inability to leave an abusive relationship, but the world was a very different place for women in the 1950s and 60s than it is today. If you've ever seen the 1950s show, The Honeymooners, you know what I mean. So Ralph, who is the husband, he is always threatening to send Alice to the moon while he waves his fist. To the moon, Alice! And that is hilarious, right? That people thought that was so funny. It was normal, smack your wife around. It's all good. In fact, and this was shocking, there was an article published in Time magazine in 1964 stating that couples stay in abusive relationships because it allows them to balance out each other's mental quirks. Like, what? Oh, we're still pretty archaic in the way we view women, but good Lord, that's insane. Claudia really had likely few choices but to stay. In 1959, 6% of all American women had earned a college degree, compared to 10.3% of men. In 2018, women surpassed men in college education. 35.3% of women had an earned degree, while 34.6% of men had a college degree. So in 1950, women did not have, people didn't go to college as much as they do now. Now that's just the logical step after high school. In the 1950s, not everybody went to college. And if you watch any of those other TV shows from the 50s and 60s, like Father Knows Best or Leave It to Beaver or I can't think of any others, but the mother is always at home with the children. And that was fairly common back in those days. In fact, only 34% of women worked outside of the home in 1950, while today that percentage is somewhere around 59 to 60%. It was not easy for a woman to leave her husband back then because there were just not the same opportunities available. On top of that, divorce was also not commonplace. Only 11% of children born in the 1950s were subjected to divorce. By the 70s, this number was up to 50%. Now the divorce numbers in the U.S. are starting to decrease again, and that's because the millennials didn't marry right out of high school. They put more thought and care into, not that other people didn't put thought and care into it, but they wait to get married until later, and those marriages seem to last a lot. Because, if you think back to what you were like at 18, if you got married at 18, the chances of you and your spouse still, 20, 30 years later, there are people that do it and they still are very much in love, but typically you change a lot, from your brain's not even fully developed at 18. Your brain does not finish developing before at least 25. Okay, so I'm talking about all of this because I think it's important to understand why Claudia stayed and why she didn't protect her children from her husband, right? Because I know, me looking at this, and it's very easy to look at a situation from the outside and say what you do. It's very different when you're actually in that situation. Claudia likely felt like she had no options. She was very young when she and James got married. I think she was 19. She was very young when they got married. She got pregnant very quickly. And then their second child was born not long after Danny. So here she was with few skills, no ability to work outside of the house, and 2 children. So it would not have been easy for her to leave. And this is way back before the days when, way back before there were battered women's shelters and networks in place that help women get out of these really terrible situations. Years later, Danny's family members would come forward to describe to the courts what sort of childhood Danny had. And according to Danny's Aunt Agnes, Danny grew up knowing he was not wanted or loved. Right after Danny was born, Agnes told James that he should be proud of his beautiful baby, but James replied, "Never will I ever be proud of him. As far as I'm concerned, he is Claudia's boy. That's not my son." Agnes remembered one instance when Danny was about 6 months old, and Claudia needed Agnes to come get her and take her out to go do laundry. When Agnes showed up, James told her to leave, and then he kicked Danny, who slid across the hallway and into the wall. Then James pulled a gun on Agnes, so James is a real sweetheart. On August 15th, 1955, Danny's brother Kevin is born. After Kevin was born, James's abuse of Danny escalated. In 1958, Claudia left James for 6 months. Okay, so Danny in his first 5 years of life was abused. He witnessed his mother being abused. He witnessed his little brother being abused. And it was unlikely that he was able to bond properly with Claudia. In 1959, Danny was 5 years old. And it was around this time that James lost his job. And although Claudia was working, they weren't making enough money to survive on their own. So the family moved in with Claudia's sister, Agnes. This arrangement did not last for more than 6 months because Agnes, try as she might, could not control James. The abuse that Danny and Kevin endured while living with Agnes was horrific. The boys were constantly bruised and in pain, and on more than a dozen occasions, Agnes came home to find that James had tied the boys up. Twice, the boys were blindfolded at the dinner table, and Agnes finally had enough and told James to leave. And unfortunately, Claudia and the boys went with him. The family moved into Claudia's parents' house. And it was right around this time when Danny's father took him to visit his paternal grandparents in Columbus, Georgia. So these are James's parents. During their visit, Danny's grandfather, Homer, was bragging to the child about his work as a reserve deputy sheriff, showing Danny his gun. And it was then that James decided that he should go become a police officer. At one point, Danny told his grandfather, Homer, that someday he was going to be a hunter. It was during this visit that James decided that he would become a police officer. So, with Danny in tow, James headed back to Shreveport, Louisiana, where he and Claudia had been living with her parents, and he started the process of joining the Shreveport, Louisiana Police Department. During Danny's 5th year, several other things were happening. There was a time that Danny stole a candy bar, but his parents caught him and they made him take it back to the store and apologize. So at 5, is this an early sign of antisocial behavior? Well, it depends on how it's handled. 5-year-olds understand intellectually that stealing is wrong, but they often have trouble controlling impulses. So it's the job of the parent to help them learn how to control their impulses. So the act of a 5-year-old stealing a candy bar doesn't mean that the kid has an antisocial personality disorder. However, if the situation is not handled properly, then this could be a sign of problems that might come later. It was also sometime in 1959 that Danny suffered a head injury. He fell off the back doorstep and hit his head on concrete. His eyes rolled back in his head, and the fall left a big dent on his forehead. So, a head injury at age 5. Could this have caused frontal lobe damage? Well, very well could have. Now, what does the frontal lobe do? Well, the frontal lobe is the part of the brain that develops last. The frontal lobe is one of the last parts of the brain to fully develop. In fact, it is not fully developed until you're at least 25 years old. So, the frontal lobe is what is responsible for your higher mental functions, your behavior, impulse control, personality, critical thinking. So if you've ever heard of the story of Phineas Gage, Phineas Gage was a railroad worker in the 1800s who somehow managed to get a tamping iron, which is just a long piece of almost like rebar. This tamping iron went up into his right eye socket and into the frontal lobe of his brain. This is a common case study that's used in psychology and biology courses. But before Phineas's injury, he was a delightful man, hard worker, all this kind of stuff. And after the injury, it totally changed his personality. So the frontal lobe is really where your personality sits, right? And part of the frontal lobe is activated by social cognition tasks. And these involve self-knowledge, person perception, and mentalizing. So basically, it's understanding that other people have thoughts and feelings that are different from your own. And it's also where critical thinking develops. I always tell my students that one of the reasons that your car insurance drops at age 25 is because your brain is, fully developed or pretty close to it. So stupid things you would have done at 16, you're probably not going to do at 25, right? Now, on December 25th of 1959, James found a puppy when he was out working, and he brings this puppy home for the boys. And the boys named the puppy Rocky. And Rocky was Danny's best friend throughout his childhood. In 1961, when Danny was 7, the family moved to a house on West Canal Street in Shreveport. Once they were there, James promptly set up traps in the backyard to catch cats. Okay, so not only would he catch the cats, he would shoot the cats with a .22 and he would watch them die. Delightful. One of the neighbors, a woman named Inez Hutto, she had a boy Danny's age and hoped the two would be friends, right? And it's always great for a kid to have a friend in the neighborhood about the same age. But Inez later described Danny at that time as a handsome boy with sad eyes, and those sad eyes gave him a wimpy appearance. And she felt Danny really needed a friend. Another neighbor that is given the alias Carmen Ringer attempted to befriend Danny, but was unsuccessful. Ringer would state that Danny seemed to always be sulking because of some kind of punishment. And one time Ringer showed Danny a cut on his hand in an attempt to bond with him, and Danny clearly had no interest in it, nor did he care. So by age 7, it seemed pretty clear that Danny had no compassion for anyone. By age 9, in 1963, Danny tried to break up fights between his parents, but then James would beat Danny. James would often hit Danny with a belt. And one time when Danny tried to break up a fight between his parents, James came running after him with a frying pan, hitting him in the face with it. There is some discussion in various places that a cousin sexually molested Danny. Danny would later deny that this happened or minimize it. There's no real clear answer out there as to whether or not Danny was molested. What did happen when Danny was 9 is that Claudia had a nervous breakdown and she was hospitalized for a significant period of time. Danny was in 3rd grade when this happened. Danny ended up failing the 3rd grade, and he claims it's because he missed school due to measles, mumps, croup, and tonsillitis, and he lost a bunch of weight. But before that, he did fairly well in school. He was not, he wasn't the top student in the class, but he certainly wasn't the worst. His teachers would say that Danny was rude and inattentive. There were a bunch of petty thefts that went on in the class in 3rd grade, things from the children, things from other teachers. And these petty thefts were linked to Danny, so we're seeing some antisocial behavior continuing. There were school counselors that described him as suffering from an inferiority complex with aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control. They recommended that he get counseling, but let's see what James did. Instead of getting him counseling, James beat him and called him a failure. Danny was held back, and he'd end up being in the same grade as his younger brother, Kevin. Danny's mother, Claudia, was a bit of an artist or had some artistic interests, and she taught Danny how to draw. So Danny would use these artistic abilities as an escape. By age 10, this once church-going religious family stopped attending church altogether at James's insistence. Now, whether or not a family goes to church, I don't think that really is either here nor there. However, the constant instability in the home is very difficult for young people to have to be around. Well, what father doesn't want to teach their son how to drive, right? Most fathers wait until the child is old enough to see over the steering wheel, but not James. James attempted to teach both Danny and Kevin how to drive, and he taught them how to drive on an old truck that had a clutch that was really hard to manage. Now, when the boys didn't perform properly, James would slap Danny in the face and yell at him for not knowing how to use the clutch. Because, right, what 10-year-old doesn't know how to use a clutch? Just the things that, if this stuff is true, the things that James said and did to these boys is just ridiculous. By 1965, Danny was 11 years old. And according to Danny, in his book, The Making of a Serial Killer, he and Kevin one day went out swimming, and they came back from the pool and to find their mother in the bathroom with a razor blade in her hand, seemingly attempting to commit suicide. Can you imagine being a 9 and 10-year-old boy coming home to find your mother in such a state? I mean, that must have been horrible. So the boys walk into the middle of this fight. Their mother has a razor in one hand, their dad is screaming at her, and Danny tried to stop James from beating his bloodied mother, but his father beat him for interfering. Well, turns out later, Claudia told her sister Agnes that James forced that razor into her hand and told her to slit her wrist. So he was trying to get her to kill herself. Claudia ended up in the hospital again for a long time. And Danny said that this time, when she went away, part of him died. His hatred for school continued, and it was at age 11, Danny discovered alcohol, and he would steal it or get it from friends, right? Because there's nothing better for an 11-year-old than drinking alcohol. At the end of this episode, we'll talk more about the impact of alcohol use on the developing brain and what sort of terrible things that may have done. It was around 11 years old that Danny began to have violent and sadistic fantasies that were sexually charged. This is never good and often a sign of a budding serial killer. In 1966, Danny is 12. And in August of 1966, the day before Danny and Kevin, who are in the same grade, were about to start the 7th grade, James shaved Danny's head, and Danny was mercilessly teased because of it. In September of 1966, again, Danny's 12, James caught Danny drinking with a friend and dragged him home by the neck. And when Danny mouthed off to him, James took him to the jail, and there Danny sat for 2 weeks. His mother was not allowed to go see him. His father did not visit him. When Danny was released, he wouldn't speak to anyone, not even his mother. He ran away in the middle of the night, and he stayed in the woods for as long as he could before his hunger got the best of him. While he was out in the woods, he would masturbate to scenes of death and revenge against women, and his hatred of women was really taking firm control at this time. Every serial killer that I have studied or read about seems to have this same sexually sadistic fantasy life. And when an individual, especially in an individual whose brain is still developing, when an individual masturbates to a specific fantasy, something called operant conditioning happens. Operant conditioning is the brain's response to reward or punishment. And according to Anil Agrawal in Forensic and Medico-Legal Aspects of Sexual Crimes and Unusual Sexual Practices, quote, when a deviant fantasy or act is followed by an orgasm, the deviant act begins to occur at a greater frequency. So in operant conditioning, the orgasm is the ultimate reward. And so when you're fantasizing on something sadistic or violent, then that has to escalate almost in order to continue to achieve that ultimate release. James's abuse of Danny and Kevin continued. In 1967, when Danny was 13 and Kevin would have been 11 or 12, they didn't mow the lawn properly. So obviously the only thing James could do would be to handcuff the boys together on the floor and then kneel on their chests, right? I mean, isn't that how you get your kids to mow the lawn properly? After this, Danny threatened to commit suicide. So hopefully I'm painting a pretty good picture of a very tumultuous, anxiety-laden childhood for both Danny and Kevin. So Danny's deviant behavior continued to escalate and entered new realms. When Danny was 14, so in 1968, a friend introduced him to voyeurism, that's according to Danny anyway, by taking him to peer into a neighbor's bathroom and watch as a pretty high school cheerleader got out of the shower. Danny would later say that although he enjoyed looking at the pretty women, that there was also this sense of being part of whatever family was in that house. Well, he continued to engage in voyeurism, was caught a couple times by neighbors. One time, his father caught him and, of course, beat him for it. So you would think that the beating that Danny endured would be enough to dissuade him from continuing voyeuristic activities. However, that's not how operant conditioning works. One example or one way of putting this in perspective is this, that if there's some kind of painful or unpleasant punishment that follows some deviant activity, it should quell that behavior. But throw somebody in who has antisocial personality disorder or some sort of psychopathy, and there's not an ability to feel guilt or to feel empathy. So even though Danny received beatings for being a voyeur, that wasn't enough to quell the drive that led him to engage in such activities. So what's voyeurism? Well, voyeurism is a paraphilia, and it's likely a distortion of part of what's called a courtship process. Under normal circumstances, an individual will go through 4 stages of courtship, the 4th stage being copulation or completion of the sexual conquest, whatever. So there are 4 phases of the courtship process that occur in a normal interaction. There's search for a partner, pre-tactile interaction, tactile interaction, and genital union. So basically what this means is search for a partner. You go out looking for somebody that you're attracted to. You will flirt with them, look at them across the room, fling your hair, bat your eyes, however it is that you do this non-physical flirting. Then from there, there's tactile interaction. So petting, kissing, touching, those sorts of things. And then the final phase of this courtship process is genital union or normal copulation. Okay, so voyeurism is a disorder of that first phase of courtship. So voyeurism, according to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5, voyeurism is defined as occurring over a period of at least 6 months with recurrent and intense sexual arousal from observing an unsuspecting person who is naked in the process of disrobing or engaging in sexual activity, and it's manifested by fantasies, urges, or behaviors. The individual has acted out on these sexual urges with a non-consenting partner, or the sexual urges or fantasies cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And the individual experiencing the arousal and or acting on the urges is at least 18 years old. So this paraphilic disorder is reinforced through operant conditioning. Most voyeurs, according to a 1988 study, reported having a negative relationship with their fathers, and 36% of voyeurs and exhibitionists reported being physically abused. According to Laws and O'Donoghue, in Sexual Deviance, Theory, and Treatment, 3 factors are central to voyeurism. One is a preoccupation, hypercathexis, which is not well understood with visual function. So one can see examples of this kind of hypercathexis in people who are not voyeurs. Artists and mathematicians are 2 classes of people who often have the sort of visual mindedness that psychoanalysts believe to be common in voyeurs. Second is postnatal experiences involving early visual exchanges with mother, as well as the fear of loss of the mother and her breast. Castration fears ignited by observing adult genitals may lead to peeping as a means of gaining a sense of mastery over what was once a fearful or overstimulating episode. And finally, early trauma during the first or second year of life that cripples the relationship of the mother and the child, right? So Danny's inability to bond with Claudia because of James. Such trauma is thought to result in pregenital fixation, sexual identity problems, and impairment of both ego and superego. So I was curious as to what percentage of voyeurs went on to commit rape. And in a 1997, I had a lot of trouble finding any information on this, but in a 1997 study by Kaplan and Kruger, 37% of voyeurs engaged in rape. Into his teen years, the abuse at the hands of his father continued. There was an incident when Danny was 14, and he had the nerve to wear jeans to church. James threw him out of the house, but Claudia went out later and found him in the middle of the night, and she snuck him back into the house. By age 15, Danny's suicidal ideations had continued. In fact, in 1969, Danny slit his wrists and he wrote on the bathroom mirror in his mother's lipstick, "I tried, I just can't make it." Christmas of 1969, Danny got a guitar and he taught himself to play and write his own music. He also got a job at the Dairy Queen, but James made him quit after a week because his grades dropped. Plus, if Danny's out earning money outside of the house, then James cannot control his every move. In 1970, Danny's 16. He gets caught drinking with a homeless man behind the Sunset Drive-In. So Here's what happened. Danny had been out by a stream, and he flipped over a piece of tin, and when he did that, a copperhead snake jumped at him. Danny shot it with an arrow, but a homeless man who lived nearby sent Danny into the homeless man's quote-unquote house to get his pistol to shoot the snake. So this is what bonded Danny to this homeless guy. They became friends, and Danny would go over and he would clean up the guy's shack, and he would also drink with him. So one day, Danny drank way too much with his new friend. And Danny was so drunk that when his dad got home and realized it, James handcuffed him and called some of his cop buddies to take Danny to jail. And it was at this point Danny says he lost any respect or trust for his father. Danny got sent to juvenile detention for 2 weeks, and he spent most of that time in the hole. And that's a huge problem. I think solitary confinement is cruel and unusual in an adult. There are studies available that look at the damage that people endure by being put in solitary confinement as adults. I have not been able to find any studies that were done on children who were put in solitary confinement. But from what I know about brain development, isolating a child in that way in those formative years at age 16 can cause long-term damage to the brain's ability to function properly. Well, Danny eventually got out of juvie, and he was invited to a pool party at a female classmate's house. After everybody went home, the two of them hung out in the pool together, and this is when Danny got his first kiss from a girl. So that takes us up through Danny's childhood to age 16. So I've outlined some of the traumatic events that occurred in Danny Rawlings' life up until about age 16. But let's look at these in more depth, and let's look at them from the perspective of how psychologically, physiologically, these things may have impacted Danny. So what does the impact of alcohol use have on a developing brain? Well, the teenage or adolescent brain is far more vulnerable to the deleterious effects of alcohol than the adult brain is, and that's simply because it's not fully developed. So according to Guerrieri and Pascal in their 2009 article, teenage drinking is associated with cognitive deficit. The authors go on to describe how intoxication as an adolescent causes brain damage, impairing the normal processes of brain maturation and plasticity. And plasticity is the brain's ability to adapt. And it causes long-lasting behavioral consequences. In a study by Fien et al., the authors found that teenagers who drank alcohol regularly showed a decreased volume in the left frontal temporal parietal regions of the brain. Now, these are important because the frontal lobe of the brain is where your critical thinking, executive function, decision-making, impulse control, that's where all of that stuff is happening. The temporal lobe, this is where short-term memory, emotion, where the amygdala is housed. So it has a role in fear processing and informing memories associated with fear and mediating emotional responses. And there's part of the temporal lobe that is where social cognition, theory of mind are thought to occur. And theory of mind just is attributing thoughts, intentions, and feelings to others. The parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe is where, your motor and sensory cortex stuff occurs. So there's no doubt that alcohol exposure in an adolescent, a teenager, can cause long-term damage to the brain. Well, what about abuse? What about physical abuse, verbal abuse, mental abuse, witnessing abuse? What impact do these have on the development of a child? But before I dive into the impact of abuse on the developing brain, I want to just share with you a few more general stories of James's abuse to Danny and Kevin. So the types of physical abuse that they underwent were whippings with a belt, fisting the tops of the boys' heads, which I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I think it's taking your fist and banging the person on the top of the head. Like I keep thinking of Larry, Moe, and Curly from the Three Stooges. Except, I'm sure it actually hurt. James would handcuff the boys, he'd shove the boys, he'd hold them by their throat up against the wall. He'd whip them at least twice a week. Once, when Kevin was 14, James whipped him so badly that he wet his pants. James would belittle his family in public. The kids could not sit on the living room furniture. They could not talk at the dinner table. They could not have friends over. They couldn't pick out their own clothes or hairstyles. They couldn't breathe at the dinner table. Danny, of course, didn't hold his pencil correctly, so he would get beatings for that. James would blindfold the boys, make them wear bags on their heads, put pots on their heads, and then smack the pots with a spoon. This is some sick, sadistic shit. Once he tied the boys up to a pole outside, he would make them drop their pants to beat them, even after they entered puberty. And that's going to be sexual abuse as well. The boys remembered James kicking their first puppy to death. If Rocky, the dog that he found that Christmas Eve, if Rocky did not come running to him when James got home, he would punch and kick the dog. So if the dog didn't come greet his abuser, then the dog would get more abuse. So the boys were constantly being abused and treated terribly, watching their mother be abused. And this is awful. You would think that the one person that the boys would have to protect them would be their mother. And I'm not trying to shame Claudia or anything, because it's very easy to look from the outside into a situation and say, I would never do that. I would say, if any man, my child's father or not his father, raised a hand to my kid one time, that would be it, right? I like to say that, but I don't know what I would do in that actual circumstance. But mother is supposed to protect you. Your mother is the one who is supposed to love you beyond everyone else, right? They're the ones that love you unconditionally, right? In my eyes, I have a 20-year-old son. In my eyes, he can do no wrong. He is absolutely perfect, right? And I know he's not, but I think he is. So what role or impact is mother's ineffective protection? What role does that have on the psyche of a child? Well, the bond between mother and son is important. And when a strong bond occurs, this will result in the son will have less anxiety, he'll do better in school, he'll engage in less risky behavior, he'll develop higher levels of emotional intelligence, he'll respect women, and he will be more likely to be successful. If mother fails to protect her son, then he fails to learn to trust. For the one person he should be able to trust is his mother. So there's this recurring theme among sexually motivated serial killers, right? Mommy issues. Having an abusive, emotionally absent mother or an excessively domineering mother. These are a staple of serial killer analyses, and they have been for decades. In a 1981 study by Revich and Schlesinger, they found that in cases of sexually motivated compulsive gynocide, which is the murder of women, there was some unhealthy emotional involvement with the mother. They felt that this resulted in a displacement of affect from mother to other women, culminating in a displaced matricide. So there's a fusion of aggression and sex. And we see that in, look at Ed Kemper, for example. He had major mommy issues. And who did he kill? Who was the last person he killed? His mother. All right, now, often children who fail to properly bond or attach with their mothers develop something called reactive attachment disorder, and it's called RAD. So RAD is a trauma and stressor-related condition of early childhood that's caused by social neglect and maltreatment. Most children with RAD exhibit a strong desire to control their environment, make their own decisions, act out with rage, violence, or self-harm. As they become teens and adults, they engage in high-risk sexual behavior, substance abuse. They have an involvement with the legal system and will often experience incarceration. I see all of that in Danny. Jay Pullen, who is the executive director of the Attachment Healing Center in Albuquerque, says that there is a huge likelihood that any given serial killer exhibited RAD as a child. Untreated in adults, RAD will manifest in detachment, withdrawal from connections, and inability to develop and maintain significant relationships, romantic or otherwise, an inability to show affection, resistance to giving and receiving love despite craving it, control issues, anger problems, impulsivity, sense of distrust, inability to fully grasp emotions, feelings of loneliness and emptiness, and the lack of sense of belonging. RAD can lead to mental health issues that include anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, dissociative disorders, and personality disorders. So who knows if Danny Rawling had RAD? I wouldn't be surprised. When Danny and Kevin were growing up, not only were they abused by their father, not protected by their mother, but they also witnessed domestic violence in their father beating their mother. The question of nature versus nurture has been debated for many, many, many years. Some people believe that everything about you has only to do with your genes. Some people think that everything about you has only to do with the type of environment you grew up in. And then there's actually what's true, which means that it's a combination of both nature and nurture that shapes who you become. So there's a neuroscientist named Dr. James Fallon. And if you're interested in this stuff, Google him look for him on YouTube and look for any of his psychopath talks. So not Jimmy Fallon, the talk show host, but James Fallon, his name is. But James Fallon, he discovered that psychopathy is the result of a group of things, right? So you have a genetic predisposition, right? So if you've heard of the warrior genes, things like that. So you have some sort of genetic predisposition to it. You are either abused or exposed to violent abuse in 4 dimensions at a critical point in your early childhood development. And then the final piece of that is brain trauma. So psychopathy, in Dr. James Fallon's opinion, and I think he's right, is the result of some kind of genetic vulnerability, abuse, and some sort of trauma to the brain. So Danny Rawling's got just a little bit of all of that. Your brain is particularly vulnerable during certain developmental periods. So maltreatment, vulnerability, sensitivity periods, there's a few of them. So the prefrontal cortex, the gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, which is a small area of the frontal lobe of the brain, it's always vulnerable to maltreatment, but that vulnerability is particularly high from ages 13 to 18. Hippocampal volume, there are 2 periods, ages 3 to 5 and 11 to 15. And so hippocampal volume has to do with storing memories, short-term memories and the long-term memories. There's often a decreased hippocampal volume in people who suffer from PTSD, for example. There's another area of the brain called the inferior longitudinal fasciculus. And this is particularly vulnerable from ages 7 to 9 and 11 to 15. And so there are thought disorders, visual motion, cognitive impairments, and other symptoms that can arise as a result of this. And so the inferior longitudinal fasciculus is just an area of the brain. I don't want to go into too much detail about where it is, but it is correlated to, or damage to it is correlated to thought disorders, cognitive impairments, those sorts of things. Now, there's also a time when the right amygdala, when the gray matter of the right amygdala is particularly sensitive, and this is from ages 9 to 13. And again, the amygdala is sort of your fear center, and it increases in volume in individuals who have PTSD and other generalized anxiety disorders. Now, your brain can also change as a result of experiencing domestic violence and abuse. The frontal lobe, which we know is responsible for higher mental functions, behavior, impulse control, personality, critical thinking, etc., etc. The frontal lobe is vulnerable throughout your entire life, but especially up until about age 25. One portion of the frontal lobe is, I think I mentioned this a little while ago, It's activated by social cognition tasks, and these involve self-knowledge, person perception, and mentalizing. So person perception is the general tendency of humans to form impressions of other people. An area of the frontal lobe called the prefrontal cortex, it is important in inhibiting impulses, and it allows us to exhibit proper social behavior. A smaller part of that, called the orbitofrontal cortex, is involved in understanding changes in the value of a reward. So if there's damage to the orbitofrontal cortex, this can lead to an increase in risky behavior with the absence of anxiety about that behavior. Now, there's another area called the medial prefrontal cortex, and this is where the extinction of the fear response happens. Okay, so in this area, we've got the frontal lobe. Within the frontal lobe, we have the prefrontal cortex, the orbitofrontal cortex, and then the medial prefrontal cortex. All of those areas together help people control themselves, right? So it helps you keep your impulses under control. It helps you act the way you should. And it also helps you have anxiety about a bad behavior or a risky behavior. So when there's a decrease in gray matter volume, so when there's a decrease in the amount of neurons and synapses there are, then this can cause a person to act impulsively without thinking through the consequences and with having no fear of what those consequences might be. There are these things called somatic markers, and these are feelings in the body that are associated with emotions. So like rapid heart rate and anxiety and nausea with disgust. So this would be like if where scent is such a huge memory trigger. So if you smell something that, like my dad smoked cigars when I was growing up. So to this day, I love the smell of cigars. Okay, so, but if my dad had been a horrible, abusive person, and then the smell of cigars might trigger a very different response in me, right? But these somatic markers are where feelings are stored within your body. These somatic markers are processed in part of the prefrontal cortex and in the amygdala. In the somatic marker hypothesis, it states that there's emotional processes that guide our behavior and decision making. So if we've got damage in any of these areas, so it's obvious then why damage to any of these areas can be so catastrophic for the developing human. Now, when a child is verbally abused by a parent, this is associated with an increase in gray matter volume in the auditory cortex, right? So this is where sound is processed. There's also a diminished integrity of the arcuate fasciculus. Don't you love these wonderful anatomy words? So in other words, there's an increase in the ability to process incoming auditory information, but there's a decrease in the ability to properly interpret that incoming information. So near the arcuate fasciculus is where interpreting that auditory information happens. This comes from an article, a 2016 article by teacher Sampson, Anderson, and Ohashi, and a 2012 article by Hart and Rubia. So maltreatment is further associated with decreased centrality. And what centrality is, it's connectedness or importance. So a decreased centrality in brain regions involved in emotional regulation, which include the left anterior cingulate gyrus, the right occipital pole, left temporal pole, and right medial frontal gyrus. And just as a side note, if you're interested in better understanding the brain, or at least seeing where things are, you can go to www.skbpod.com and click on the blog page, and I've got a brain blog that talks about all the different parts of the brain and what they do and what they're important for. Plus, I have labeled pictures of actual brain tissue, so that might be fun to look at. If you have a weak stomach or are grossed out by the thought of looking at a real human brain, don't look at that blog post. But anyway, so maltreatment is associated with decreased centrality in regions of the brain involved in emotional regulation. It is associated with the ability to accurately attribute thoughts or intentions to others. And it is also associated with enhanced centrality in regions involved in internal emotional perception, self-referential thinking, and self-awareness. Now, the anterior cingulate gyrus is interconnected within the limbic system, and the limbic system is it's like your emotional brain. Overall affect, assigning emotions to internal and external stimuli, making vocalizations associated with the expression of states or desires. These are thought to be involved in decision-making and even management of social behavior, emotional regulation, attention, and social cognition. Now, another part of the brain, the right occipital pole, contains part of the primary visual cortex, so that's where the information your eyes bring in is interpreted, and how a response is developed to whatever your eyes are interpreting. Then the temporal pole, which is on the front part of the temporal lobe of the brain. The temporal pole is associated with social cognition, theory of mind, which is attributing thoughts, intentions, and feelings to others. So when there's damage to the temporal pole, then that individual is going to have problems with theory of mind. So they're not going to be able to attribute thoughts, intentions, or feelings to others. And so this you can understand, but in a psychopath who does not have an ability to feel empathy, it's likely there's something going on in that temporal pole, because especially the murderous psychopath does not view that victim as an actual living, breathing, thinking person. And that's hard for those of us that actually have empathy. It's hard to envision what that would feel like to lack empathy. So maltreatment is also associated with increased centrality in areas involved with self-awareness. So the areas, and again, these names are all ridiculous, but the precuneus and the anterior insula, and again, you can look at the blog if you're interested in reading more about these, but the precuneus is a component of an area of the brain called the default mode network, and it's involved in self-referential thinking, so the tendency to view innocuous stimuli as having a specific meaning for the self, and is associated with personality traits and disorders, as well as self-centered mental imagery. And this is often associated with narcissistic personality disorder. So basically, the whole world revolves around me. That happens as a result of damage to the And then we have the anterior the anterior insula, which is the insula is a lobe of the brain, and again, you can look at pictures of this online. The insula is just medial to the temporal lobe. It's a smaller lobe of the brain. It contains an interoceptive representation that provides the basis for all subjective feelings from the body. So it's often activated in conjunction with the anterior cingulate gyrus, and together they seem to function as a limbic, sensory, and motor cortices that respectively engender the feelings, insula, and the motivations that constitute any emotion. So some have argued that the anterior insula provides a critical substrate for self-awareness. Again, you can refer to the 2014 article by teacher Anderson Ohashi and Polcari. Now I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Danny Rawling likely suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of childhood abuse. So let's talk about what PTSD does to the brain in a little bit more detail. Okay, so the hippocampus, which is part of the limbic system, this acts in memory consolidation. So there's decreased volume of the hippocampus in people with depression, as well as in people with PTSD. And the hippocampus has been found in children with PTSD to have a larger volume. And this may be due to a sudden growth spurt in it following trauma. And it forms a scar, but then it may shrink following maturation. The amygdala, which controls our autonomic responses that are associated with fear, arousal, and emotional stimulations. In adults with PTSD, the amygdala shows increased volume. And because the amygdala signals the hypothalamus to trigger fight or flight, and it does this often before you even become aware of the damage, that when an individual is suffering from PTSD or some sort of anxiety disorder, they're going to stay in a heightened state of alertness. So stuff that shouldn't, or not, I don't want to say shouldn't, stuff that is not a danger might trigger a fight or flight response regardless. So children being abused is terrible. Being neglected is terrible. But what about the impact of viewing domestic violence on the development of a child? Well, according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the long-term effects of this include physical health problems, behavioral problems in adolescence, delinquency, alcohol or substance abuse, emotional difficulties in adulthood, depression, anxiety, PTSD. Children learn from viewing domestic violence. They learn destructive lessons about the use of violence and power in relationships. Children may learn that it's acceptable to exert control or to relieve stress by using violence, or that violence is in some way linked to expressions of intimacy and affection. And that's where things can get really bad. If the person you love is violent towards you, right, then how are you able to separate that violence out from your feelings of intimacy towards one another? Well, short-term effects of witnessing domestic violence. From birth to age 5, you'll see an increase in aggression, sleep and eating disruptions, as well as intense anxiety and fear in that child. From age 6 to 11, you'll see nightmares, aggression, and difficulty with peer relationships, difficulty with concentration and task completion, withdrawal and or emotional numbing. So far, Danny Rawlings seems to hit every single one of these things. From age 12 to 18, you'll see antisocial behavior, possibly, not all the time, but sometimes you'll see antisocial behavior, school failures, impulsive or reckless behavior such as substance abuse, running away, violent or abusive dating relationships, depression, anxiety, withdrawal, all of this, right? So it's not enough to not hit your kid. Children should also not be exposed to violence between intimate partners. According to teacher Samson Anderson at Nohashi from 2016, witnessing multiple episodes of domestic violence leads to decreased integrity of the left inferior longitudinal fasciculus. So that's that area of the brain that I mentioned earlier, that if there is damage or if it's exposed to domestic violence during one of its vulnerably sensitive periods, it can damage this inferior longitudinal fasciculus, can cause thought disorders and cognitive impairment. So further damage to the inferior longitudinal fasciculus has been associated with secondary derealization, or some sort of perceptual alteration. So what does that mean? Well, if we look at a 2018 study by Herbert et al., quote, disruption of the ILF, or the inferior longitudinal fasciculus, may constitute the pathophysiological basis for visual hallucinations and socio-emotional impairments in schizophrenia, as well as emotional difficulties in the autism spectrum disorder, end quote. So remember this bit about visual hallucinations, because this is going to be important as we continue to follow Danny Rawlings on his development into becoming a serial killer. So boys who are abused by their fathers, there's obviously the physical and emotional pain that occur, and this pain, it follows the same pathway as, emotional pain, right? So physical and emotional pain follow the same pathway. They use the same circuitry. According to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, physical abuse can cause children to struggle with developing and maintaining friendships, to not trust authority figures. They won't feel good about themselves or see themselves as worthy. They may blame themselves for the abuse and feel that they must keep what goes on in their families a secret. They might, in fact, lose their fight or flight response. Further, according to Psychology Today, nurturing and support helps child's brain to develop. Hostile environments affect parts of the brain that are important in order to feel good, to feel happy, to bond with others, to have empathy, for all of these fantastic parts of being a human. So over the course of this episode, I've talked about Danny's childhood up until age 16. Join me for episode 2. And in episode 2, I'm going to tell you all about Danny Rawlings' military service. I'm going to discuss with you his journey into drug abuse and Danny's yearning for love. Thank you for joining me today in my quest to understand the evil that was Danny Rawling. SKB is researched, written, produced, everything by me, Dr. Caroline Clark Rivera. If you enjoy the podcast and can deal with my very amateur recording, please feel free to follow me on most of your social media platforms at SKB Pod. You can visit my website at www.skbpod.com for more information. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to give it a 5-star review and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or whatever your podcast player of choice is.
Makes me wonder if you would ever care. Just finally hurting me more than I love you. Yes, you closed the door and you said we are through. You finally hurting me more than I love you. I stroll along the beach. I hear the seagulls cry. They sail across the waves into a clear blue sky. No, the human heart, such a fragile thing, like rain it weeps, like the wind it sings, and you finally hurt me more than I love you. Yes, you closed the door and you said we are through. You finally hurt me more than I love you. You know when you went away, my world came tumbling down. Now my life's a three-ring circus. I'm a lonely clown, and you finally hurt me more